make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
And again, a minority of Christians, but nonetheless, a group of Christians, both black and white, really promoted this and said, that slavery is wrong according to our faith, because it's making people made in God's image subhuman. And that is evil. And that when that argument was made that slavery is sin, that was key. And in the 1880s, people started saying slavery is sin. Once you identify something as sin, then if you're a believer, you've got to do something about it. You can't just you just can't let it hang. And so that was the key move, is when people started identifying slavery as sin. And that happened in the 1830s.
Hi there to our listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on the YouTube channel, this is Josh Burtram. I'm your faithful host. Our ever political host, Will, was not able to be with us here today. We miss you, Will, and we love you. Where are you, Will? But anyway, all that aside, it's great to be back for another episode of Faithful Politics. Make sure that you like and subscribe, hit the notification button so you can get all of the great content that we're producing for you. And today, it is my distinct pleasure to have on the show A.G. Miller and Doug Strong. They're two of the contributors to a new book out of InterVarsity Press called Awakening to Justice, Faithful Voices from the Abolitionist Past. And we get to talk about that important work and also its connections to today, and then anything else that we want to address, including and potentially the election results, because on the day of recording, it is Wednesday, November 6th, and the results have been in that Donald J. Trump will be the 47th president, I think. It's 47 now, of the United States. Without any further ado, I'd like to have our guests introduce themselves. So, AG, we can start with you. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you got into writing a book about the abolitionist past.
Well, thank you, Josh. It's great to be on the show here today. A.G. Miller is my name. It comes from my father, Albert, and my maternal grandfather, George, both bullheaded Methodist ministers who wanted to have a piece of me.
Yeah. Is there any other kind?
And it was my cousin who my mother helped to raise. He was 19 when I was born. His name was John. He went on to become a Pentecostal bishop. And he said, I'll settle the dispute. I said, Uncle, Grandpa, I'll settle the dispute. I'll call him AG. And it stuck. So from infancy, I've carried my initials as my name. Everyone who knows me by AG. But I more recently, I am a retired professor from Oberlin College, where I taught in the religion department as an associate professor of religion and Africana studies. I focus my work on 19th and 20th century American religions, mostly, looking at the rise of Black church traditions, looking at the rise of evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, Black theology, etc. Those are kind of my areas of interest and expertise. And that kind of drew me into this orb. As you may know, the book, two of its characters in the book that we focus on have a strong Oberlin connection. And so as Doug was organizing the process, he wanted to hold, actually it was the very first meeting of the group in Oberlin, to both catch the spirit of this place and its history, but to bring all of our writers and collaborators together. And so he asked me to ask if I would be willing to organize the conference and to help him to organize the conference. And we did. And we're very happily to do so. And the more I got involved, the more I said, wow, this is an interesting project. Maybe I ought to see if I can contribute a chapter. And so that was kind of how I got involved. And I knew at least 2, 3, 4 of the participants who were involved in the project, and including our beloved David Daniels, who, wow, he's really at the heart of this thing, and he just passed away. He's gone on to be in glory. Well, unexpected for us, but he battled with cancer, unknown to us, and then we later found out, and he died in early October. So we're feeling a big hole lost in our group.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And as you see his chapter in the book, but also his contribution to the film was absolutely critical to the film, the adjacent film that comes with this. And but that's who I am. I also teach a bit at Ashland Theological Seminary. I'm now retired, so I can teach around, and I do so.
Yeah.
I serve as a pastor for the Oberlin House of the Lord Fellowship. We're a part of the larger, smaller group of a denomination called the House of the Lord Churches, and it's a Pentecostal body, mostly on the East Coast. And I kind of pioneered this church out here, and serve as its pastor, and I serve on its national board of elders, which kind of gives direction to the church. And so, besides that, I'm a father of 4 great kids, 3 married, 1 soon to be married.
Awesome.
Eldest son is now 48. In fact, he proposed on his 48th birthday. And
there you go. What a birthday present.
Our eldest son and the very last to get married. So it's all good. 5 grandchildren, the newest of which was born in September. And so I'm a proud grandfather. So I think my wife, Brenda, and I have been married almost 49 years. So we're trying to make life and ministry together here. So I think that help?
Thank you so much.
Sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm a fellow Pentecostal. At least I was born into Pentecostalism in the Assemblies of God.
Yeah.
So I understand that aspect of that world at least. And Doug, tell us a little bit about yourself, and and then even along that, kind of talked about how this project and this book came about. I know there was an interesting discovery that kind of brought this book about. So I'd love for you to go into that.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, and thanks, AG. Yeah, I'm Doug Strong. I teach history of Christianity and theology courses in general, history courses at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, Washington, which is a Christian institution. I'm an ordained Methodist minister. I pastored a church for quite a few years in New Jersey when I lived there, and I used to teach in Washington, D.C. at Wesley Theological Seminary there. But what happened is a friend of mine and ours, Chris Momini, who was the chaplain at Adrian College, which is a small Methodist-related college in Michigan, they were renovating a building, the oldest building on campus, and as they were tearing out the inside of the building in a closet that they were ripping out, there was way back in the shelf, top shelf of the closet, they found a box, those people doing the construction, and they didn't know what to do with it. Rather than throw the box out, thankfully, they took it to the library and they said, "What do we do with this?" And the librarian said, "We don't know what to do with this." And so then they asked Chris, who is a historian, to look at this diary, really a notebook with yellowed pages and handwriting with dates on it that said 1839, 1840, 1841. What is this? And as he did some sleuthing, historical sleuthing, he figured out this is actually the diary of an abolitionist, that is somebody in the 19th century working to end slavery. And who this guy was an Oberlin College graduate, so this is the connection to AG, who was trained as a pastor and as a missionary, and as a young man, fresh out of college, he went with his new wife to Jamaica to work with recently emancipated enslaved people in Jamaica to start churches and to start schools, because the people had been freed, but they had no education, they had no job training, and so that was his purpose. And then he recruited an African-American woman from Boston named Nancy Prince to come down and be a teacher with him. And he was also a colleague, a classmate of an African-American at Oberlin who also wrote a diary. And so we decided, this, Chris and me and AG and about 10 other folk, we decided to gather together in Oberlin. And then we've had a couple other times together where we discussed what is the significance of this brand new diary that nobody's seen, almost 200-year-old diary, but also what he was saying, because the diary is powerful in that he's talking about his faith in Christ, the ways in which he's being transformed by the Holy Spirit, the ways in which he's praying to the Lord, singing hymns. He's quoting scripture. And then while he's saying, Lord, please help me to be a better believer, help me to be stronger in my faith, because this is a personal diary, like a journal. Often the next statement is, and show me how to be more allied with the oppressed. Help me, because he was a white man, help me to see what I can do to be more in support of those who are being persecuted because of their race. And he really understood this and saw a seamlessness between his personal, deep faith in Christ and his work for justice with trying to end slavery and racism. And to him, there was no separation between the two at all. He would, as I said, in his journal, he would often say, Lord, help me to be more faithful to you. And the next sentence would be, and help me to figure out how to work more effectively to end oppression. So amazing kind of connections and the ways in which a true faith in Christ is also going to lead us to love not only of God, but of neighbor.
Yeah, that is amazing. What an amazing story, and what a cool story about this discovery of something that you had no idea was there. I think about how many times people have thrown out, old things, gotten rid of things they thought were garbage, and how much of it is like, treasure that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And so what makes this discovery, besides its age, besides, I would guess, the uniqueness of having a Southern white abolitionist, maybe not even besides that, what is the significance of this? You can start, AG.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, he's not a Southerner. He's a Northerner.
Gotcha.
He's from Michigan. In fact, his family comes from New England, and they migrate into New England, and he comes into Tulane Seminary as one of his stops of education in Cincinnati. And then, of course, that whole group with what was called the Lane Rebels, they organized a abolitionist movement at Lane Seminary in Cincinnati. I don't know if you know anything about Cincinnati's history. It was the most southern town along the Ohio River. And it was very closely attached to Kentucky and to the Kentucky slavery system, but the Kentucky economy. Even today, when you fly into the Cincinnati airport, you fly into what's the town in Kentucky? You don't fly Covington. That's right, Covington, Kentucky. So so Kentucky and Cincinnati are very closely aligned, but it's also a major stop on the Underground Railroad. And so there were lots of folk who were escaping and were finding refuge in Ohio, 1830s. And that was not an easy time, because there were many instances in Cincinnati when Black people had to flee for their lives out of Cincinnati because of abolitionist movement, the anti-abolitionist movement, et cetera, et cetera. So just so you'll get a context for who Ingram was and where he came from. But it seems to me that one of its most significant components is both exactly the time frame in which it is written and the calcification of slavery in the American system. It is codifying itself. It is solidifying itself. And as you know, 20 years later, you have the Fugitive Slave Act that is passed that now moves it out of just being a Southern institution, but now the legal forces in the North are required to assist Southern slave catchers to take and capture freedom seekers to bring them back into slavery. This is in and around the same time that you have the Missouri Compromise, 1820, just a few years before that. that allows Missouri to come in as a slave state and Maine to come in as a free state. So you have this whole kind of a time of fluidity in American culture where the whole issue of slavery is being battled. And here you have at Oberlin and in other surrounding communities and other communities across the country who are a solidification of a group of individuals who are committed to not just to abolition, but to justice and to what we might call the beloved community. And you see this in this diary, the ways in which he is, even in Jamaica, the ways in which he is treating his parishioners differently than other white missionaries who are coming in and are doing. They're not eating at the same table with their parishioners. He's inviting them into their home. He's building relationships with them. He is treating them as humans and with dignity, etc. Where his other friends, he's being ostracized in some ways. He and his wife, Betsy, are being ostracized for living out the gospel as he understands it. And you'll see the similar activities in Nancy Prince and in also the ways in which James Ingram talk about their lives in slavery and their faith. And so I think that particularly this diary really comes at this really crucial time in American history in which you have an unsung voice. That is, we know about the Sojourner Truths and the Harriet Tubmans, and we know about the William Lloyd Garrisons, and we know even about his colleague, I always block his name, whose house he dies in. Doug, help me out here. Ingram dies in the house of
Theodore Weld.
Theodore Weld, exactly. Thank you. Weld always skips our mind, but Theodore Weld and others who are more the kind of known heroes of the abolitionist movement. But these three individuals are relatively unknown. And I think that the insights to his diary gives us a whole new window to look into, and to the other two, their journals and diary and memoirs, give us a whole new way of thinking about the so-called little people, the people who aren't the well-known folk, and how they took their faith serious and they took liberation serious. So, I mean, that's how I might respond to your question.
Yeah. Let me jump in. I think one of the most significant things about this project is that we're trying to lift up the voices of ordinary Christians who were not famous, who somehow they clearly made a difference by their lives, even providing education for people who didn't have it. David Ingram, when he's in Jamaica, sees there's a ship that had brought slaves from Africa illegally, and the British Navy captured that ship and released the 500 people that were on board and freed them. And then David Ingram looks at that ship and documents it and writes a diagram makes a diagram and sends it to newspapers in the U.S. to say, this is what we're supporting. That by doing that, he's educating people. Now, he's not famous, David Ingram, or wasn't until we wrote the book, but he's making a difference by just acting out on his faith.
Yeah.
That's really good. So how do you think that Ingram's perspectives add to our understanding of historical racial justice, and especially even thinking about today, trying to wrestle through the injustices that people are seeing in our world today? How do his insights and perspectives help us tackle some of our issues today?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of talk recently where movements for anti-racism, for example, in our country are being labeled as somehow socialist or anti-Christian. And what Ingram shows us is exactly the opposite. I mean, he's a white man acting as an anti-racist. I mean, that term wasn't used in the 19th century, but that's what he's doing. And he's very actively doing that. And he sees this as consistent with his faith, not against it. It is the working out of his faith in a consistent way. And I think for us to hear that that Christians in the past, evangelical Christians, because that's who he was, he was preaching about the new birth and about coming to know the Lord. And so as an evangelical Christian, he is committed to anti-racism. And to see those as naturally flowing together and out of each other is what I think is really the legacy that we can pick up from this story.
Wow, that's really good. I'm thinking about how he's writing at this time where, like, I've heard this statement by historians that I've listened to or read, that nearly everyone at that time, at least all white people, like thinking in America at that time, would be considered racist by today's standards. Would you say that he had any of those kinds of views? And that I guess what I'm getting at was, how unique was he in his treatment of people, of these ex-slaves? How unique was he, even amongst Northerners, even amongst his peers? And AG, if you want to tackle that, and then Doug, we can hear what you think.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think that slavery, the way in which much of America thought about slavery, had a range of levels of ways in which they thought about it. There were those folk who were enslavers, but it was all economically driven. And if they could free their slaves, they would, because they understood it was a sin. Some. We find that in the life of Richard Allen, who was enslaved in Delaware. He his master, as he said, was not a religious man, but in fact, he saw his master more like a father, and he worked side by side with him in the fields, etc. And it was a small farm, so it wasn't a large plantation, etc. So there are all kinds of ways in which we have to rethink about the whole issue of slavery, whether it's massive southern plantations or even northern mid slave institutions or small farms, etc. Sojourner Truth, by the way, her first language was Dutch, not even English, in Ulster, New York, Ulster County, New York. I mean, small farm slavery, and so there are many ways you can think about this. And he was able to have to lead his master into conversion, into the faith. And in his being converted, he decides that he wants to give his enslaved folk, Alan and his brother, to give them freedom, but he can't afford to set them free. And so he bargains with them. If you go and work and pay me, I will give you your freedom. So do you have that kind of relationship that's going on in the country? But then you also have a more deeper seated slavery and understanding of slavery that is based in a kind of a theocentric understanding, where they are coming to believe that Black people were innately subhuman. And were by the Cain, the curse of Cain. The curse of Ham.
Ham.
Right, the curse of Ham, that Black people were innately designed to be the servants of the other two brothers, i.e. for white people. And so, you have those kinds of understandings of slavery that are coming. But then you also have folk who say, yeah, slavery should maybe be done, but at some point in the future, and if we can help them, we will, but if not, it's okay. And then you had those folk who were far more radical in their thinking. Even Frederick, he was not necessarily committed to being anti-slavery. His primary goal is, he would say, if I can save the Union and keep slavery, I'll do it. If I have to end slavery to save the Union, I'll do that. And so he had to be convinced by Frederick Douglass and others that this was the appropriate route to go. And then you have folk who are more in the radical abolitionist standpoint, who said, no, slavery is wrong. Whether it's slavery blocks one's ability to be able to give freely unto God, as in Charles Finney and others, or those folk who said, well, regardless of whether you can give praise to God or not. You're human, and therefore it is wrong because you are a full human being. And so, so you have to kind of think about this notion of how America responded to slavery in all of these nuanced ways. Obviously, it's easier for me to look back and say, well, if you owned a slave, you were racist. Well, that might be true, but on the other hand, I think there were other levels of understanding of the institution of slavery. Now, many black folk, in fact, probably the vast majority, felt like they wanted to be free regardless of what their situation was, and they did it with their feet. They ran, or they stayed in slavery, but to work to get others free. And so I think that when you think about America, it was this very broad understanding of the institution of slavery and what did freedom mean to a wide range of folks. I'll let Doug maybe make another comment or more comments.
Yeah, I would. Thank you, AG. Yeah, I think David Ingram, you asked a good question, Josh. Is he unique? By the way, he really did. Went in every account in his journal. So it's this in the entire journal. We looked, is there any kind of inclination of kind of a implicit racism? If so, you can't see it.
Yep, exactly.
I mean, as AG mentioned, he's eating with African Americans, actually Afro-Caribbeans in Jamaica. Yep. He's interacting, he's worshiping with them. And interestingly, when everyone else is referring to people as, like whites would say, blacks, I mean, that's if they were saying it nicely. They would say other terms. But David Ingram never says that when he's talking about his congregation, which is all made up completely of of Jamaicans. He never says black. He says my people.
Yeah.
My people, which is or
it's awesome.
My dear people or my beloved people.
Right.
So, he's describing his congregation as, like he would describe his family. And so that's very interesting. Now, how widespread was his opinions? It was a minority. Most white people were clearly, as AG's mentioned, they saw African Americans as inferior and they treated them as such. But there was a minority of white people who did act in a just way towards black people. It was a small group, and almost all of them were acting out of their Christian convictions. So that's a wonderful story. We just we haven't heard a lot about that.
No, we haven't heard a lot about that. And, whenever I hear about abolitionists, I understand it was a group of people that were against slavery, working for its eradication. And they probably, I'm sure, came on a spectrum of willingness to, take whatever measures that they were willing to take to chip away at this institution or try to cripple it. But I would love for you guys to help me understand, how did the abolitionist movement come about? Right. So you have this massive slave trade. You have this massive economic, I've heard it said that there were like maybe 5 truly slave economies in history: ancient Athens, ancient Rome, the Brazil of the colonial area. I'm missing one. And then America, the American South, the antebellum South. So how did this kind of abolitionist movement really catch on, get steam? How did it even start?
Yeah, it's a complex story. Lots of books have been written about it, but really it started around 1830. This is the amazing thing. I always like to point this out to people. Americans, including most Christians, white folk justified slavery for 400 years, right? I mean, they said, yeah, it's the way it is. We're going to accept it. It's in the Bible. It's okay. What happened around 1830 is this huge switch. Some of it was this guy that AG mentions, William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. He kind of helped to popularize it. But I would argue that it would never have taken off as a movement, as a popular movement, unless Christians and again, a minority of Christians, but nonetheless, a group of Christians, both black and white, really promoted this and said, that slavery is wrong according to our faith, because it's making people made in God's image subhuman. And that is evil. And that when that argument was made that slavery is sin, that was key. And in the 1830s, people started saying slavery is sin. Once you identify something as sin, then if you're a believer, you've got to do something about it. You can't just can't let it hang. And so that was the key move, is when people started identifying slavery as sin. And that happened in the 1830s.
Yes. Go ahead, AG.
I would say that is correct for as the abolitionist movement gelled itself. But I think simultaneously, by the 80s, in the South particularly, where slavery was truly entrenched, slavery became also known by many Christians as ordained by God. And so you had this kind of two movements of moving in different directions in terms of how Christians interpreted the scriptures and their understanding of the faith. This is why by 1844, the Methodist Church in America split over the issue of slavery. Because as the Methodist Church founded itself in 1784, at the Christmas conference in Baltimore, it was very clear that it was an anti-slavery movement. And they required that none of its leadership, at least, could own slaves and become a minister in that tradition. And as that tradition grew, particularly in the South, when a bishop remarries and inherits a group of slaves, the delegates from the North say, he can't be a bishop in this church and own slaves. And it was the Southerners who then said, well, no, we disagree with that. And thus the split in the Methodist Church happened in 1844. Something similar happens in 1845 within the Baptist movement. And so slightly different, but the similar effect. And so I think that there are several things that are going on in the country that polarize the country as the Southern economy becomes more and more driven by the rise of the cotton gin and the kind of money that can come from the Southern agricultural economy is really solidifying itself and is built on slave labor.
Yeah. Yeah. We forget the economic aspect of that, right? That we've got an entire economic system that is based on, think about it. If you don't have to pay for your labor, you can make an enormous profit. And so interestingly, people can justify almost anything when you're making a lot of money.
Yeah.
When you have material interest, you can justify just about anything. And, and I'm curious to get your perspectives on this question. Why did it take so long for Christianity to develop a movement that was so anti-slavery?
Well, yeah, that's a good question.
And maybe that's not phrased well. Okay, I appreciate that. But I'm just, the Apostle Paul, he sort of addresses it, talks about freedom, but also, and I know that slavery in the ancient Rome was different.
Right.
But it was still slavery. And I know people, they struggle with that. And I understand why they struggle with that. And I think that understanding what slavery was in its vast history is important to help us wrap our minds around it and understand people in their own historical context. But I'd love to hear you guys, why do you think it was so difficult for Christianity to get their minds around this in the way that we see it today?
Can I just say this? I think we're missing an important component of this conversation.
Please.
And that is enslaved people themselves.
Right? Elaborate.
That is, many Africans who came into this country, particularly in the Great Awakening, but also the Second Great Awakening, came into the Christian faith, slave and free and enslaved, and they found a gospel of the gospel of Jesus Christ that they saw as liberating. that they could find their full humanity in that gospel, in spite of the fact that it was being given, in some cases, by slave masters themselves or pro-slavery people themselves. Their own ability, agency to interpret that gospel for themselves, and could read and hear those scriptures that said God is no respecter of a person. They could read and see the stories of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that talked about the liberation of Israel from bondage in Egypt. Moses becomes a major figure. They can interpret this. They can see Jesus, treating people who are lower than them in a certain way than other Jews. The Samaritan woman and the Good Samaritan story, and on and on. They have their ability to interpret, to do the hermeneutical work, and to come to interpretations of the faith themselves. And I want to argue that while other folk are interpreting the text and the Bible to justify slavery, they are interpreting it to say that slavery is wrong, and it's okay for me to accept that temporal freedom. If I'm spiritually free, then I'm temporally free. And therefore, I will vote with my feet. I will escape. I will sabotage. I will do whatever it takes. And remember, by 1831, you have had two or three major attempted at revolts. Herbert Aptheker talks about 100 or so slave resistance and revolts in the same time period in his book on slave revolts. But you have Nat Turner, who is an enslaved preacher who hears a word from God and decides that he is going to strike a blow. What do you think? Whatever you think about violence or nonviolence, etc., but he was driven by his understanding of his faith as interpreted through the Bible that he read. And I think that when you look at free churches in the North, they were all concerned about their enslaved brothers and sisters, both North and South, and worked to try to help in the abolitionist movement, in the Underground Railroad. I mean, that's how we get a Harriet Tubman, who could bring 100 or so of her family members and others, 16 different trips she made south into Maryland and further beyond in order to bring them north. So I want us to and that's why I think this book is also so important, because the two other voices, not just Ingram, it's Nancy Prince and it's James Bradley, who was captured as a child in West Africa and then worked his way through the slave system. Where was he, in Texas or someplace? Arkansas, where he finally is not ingenious, but his ingenuity that he could work on the side while working for his master, save enough to purchase his own freedom.
Amazing.
Right? So, I mean, I want us to, as we're thinking about this conversation, we have to think as not just about, so when we think Christian, we almost want to, we're kind of brainwashed to kind of think white.
Right. And that's not correct. And Black people are creating their own theological interpretations, and they're living it out in all kinds of ways. And that's why these other two folk are in this book, because they are living out their understanding of the faith, and to see that they too are free human beings, loved and cared for by God, and that they deserve the respect and the dignity and the humanity that everyone else does. That's so good.
Yeah.
Doug, why do you think that it took so long? Why do you think, how did this come about, and what were the forces that, kind of caused it to take so long, do you think?
Well, AG's point is well taken. That, it's true that white people some of them changed their attitude in the mid-19th century, but that wouldn't have even happened if they hadn't had close interaction with African Americans who were making this argument all along. So, for example, the switch happens right around 1830, 1831. We can see a clear,
demarcation.
and movement among white people changing their attitudes some. But it's interesting. It occurs in Boston first with this white man at the same exact time that an African American in Boston, David Walker, has written this account where he's doing what A.G. has described, where he's making a theological account and an interpretation of the Bible that says, no, the message of the Bible is very clear that it's for freedom and liberty. And he's making that, and then that account becomes well known. And so we've got white people learning from African Americans about how to interpret the Bible well.
That's right.
Which reminds me of a book that I really recommend right now called by Wheaton College professor Esau McCauley, called Reading While Black, which is about how we read the Bible. And I have learned so much as a white man about how we can interpret the scriptures through a black lens. It's interesting, right? We start to look at even stories that we think we know well in the Bible, but we look at them differently if we're reading them from a different person's perspective. And that A.G. just mentioned the Exodus story. I mean, how do we look at the Exodus? I mean, is it primarily, am I an Israelite or am I an Egyptian? Right?
That's a great question.
Yeah. So I need to ask that honestly, right? Yeah,
absolutely. We need to ask that. And I think that's one of the biggest thing that's happened to me recently in reading the scriptures is being able to say, I may not be, as being able to identify with different characters in the narrative, as opposed to always identifying with the protagonist, always identifying with the one who wins. Yeah. Right. What about what if I'm the Roman centurion? Or what if I'm the Pharisee? What if I'm the Sadducee? What if I'm the disciple without faith? Mm-hmm. What if I'm the Judaizers who really do not want something new, some weird new, radical view coming into the church and then resisting that? I would really love, why is this book so important now, right? So again, we're recording Wednesday, November 6th, a day after the election, this contentious election where a woman of color, right, was going against Donald Trump. So Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in it seemed like a very tight race. And America seems to have chosen, right? Well, they've called the election. They've chosen Donald Trump. Now, again, I'm not someone who makes a claim that people that vote for Donald Trump are racist. I'm not someone that makes the claim that people that vote for Donald Trump are somehow ignorant. I personally didn't. I've talked about that a lot on the show. That's no surprise to our listeners. I actually went third party because I really couldn't justify my own self voting for either candidate this time. But all that to say is that we're in this place where I kind of grew up and thought, hey, race was a thing of the past. We're not really worrying about that anymore. And then over the last 10 years, all of that has been shattered in my mind in terms of the broader society. And then here we have a book about this remarkable man who, very much in the minority against the vast majority of his peers, chooses and out of his faith treats these ex-slaves in Jamaica with remarkable dignity and time and love and care and concern. Why is that so important right now for us to hear that story?
Well, I think it's also interesting how this David Ingram views his own country. He loves America, and he's clearly a patriotic person, but he is also critiquing it because he believes that to be truly patriotic, to be truly loving of your country means that you also want it to be what it should be. And especially on the issues of race, we're not in a post-racial society. We post-racist society. We see that clearly. We see it in so many evidences. Have there been improvements? Yes. Is there still consistent racism? Unfortunately, yes. How did David Ingram view this? I'm going to read to you from his journal. This is when he's on the boat, he's leaving New York Harbor on his way to Jamaica. What does he say? He says, "Farewell, America. You have many things to love and many things to hate. And while I rejoice in all that's good and praise God as the author of that, I mourn that there are so many great sins about that God must ere long pour out his fury unless we repent and reform." So what he's saying is, I love America. They're great things, and we thank God for those things. But there are things that must change. And he says that he believes that God's going to judge America unless we do change. So it's a clear call from him to us, I think, that we still have, there's unfinished business that needs to be taking place in this country. I agree with you. I don't think everyone that votes for Donald Trump is a racist. I do think that Donald Trump's rhetoric allows or gives permission for people to feel like, white people, to feel like they can act and speak similarly, which means that they can then, it's justified or okay, or at least not too bad, because my president did it, to be able to ridicule or say racist things that actually I may have thought in my head but didn't feel like I could say before. I really do think that and my fear for this next 4 years is that having our leader, the leader of our country, giving voice to these concerns and speaking in such a way that is, I think, by any measure racist, allows other people to feel like that they can speak those things. Is that every Trump voter? No. But I think it does allow many people to do that.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's such a difficult thing for me because I understand why people voted for him personally. I understand why they did. I did it in 2016 and I didn't in 2020 and I didn't this time. And I don't feel a lot of animosity towards people, but I feel a concern, like you're talking about, that there's this culture where it just feels like it's hard to look at the election and not feel like in some way there is this really stark divide. And then seeing this woman of color that was not voted in, and not that she had to be. It's hard for me to really articulate it, but I definitely see it more than I've seen it in past elections. These undercurrents of white nationalism, these undercurrents of Christian nationalism, I see that much more now than I ever have. And I'm always open to people arguing and telling me why I'm not seeing that correctly. But yeah, I definitely see it. AG, what do you think about all of this? Please, your unfiltered, honest reaction.
Well, from where I sit, Donald Trump is a racist. From where I sit, he has helped to uncap sentiment that has long been pushed down in the ground. That has given, as Doug said, given them permission now to be more overtly racist, bigoted, biased against immigrants. I mean, even his biggest supporter, Elon Musk, was an illegal in this country at one time, right? So, I mean, the hypocrisy for me is that this election and the rhetoric that Donald Trump has started from the time he walked down the stairs in 2015 has always been a racist tone. He has lived that all of his life. And for the life of me, anyone who calls themselves a Christian who sees a womanizer, an accused and alleged rapist, one who has cheated people, has lies without impunity. There's no moral integrity to this person. And I think that many folk, Christians or not, have been driven by their fears and not by their moral understanding. They have twisted themselves into a pretzel in order to justify their vote for this man based on their own greed and desire for what they see as their own self-protection. And I see nowhere in the Bible that is justifiable. You notice I haven't called anybody a racist, but I just talk about from a Christian standpoint, from where I am sitting, when I am driven by my fears and not by my call to love my neighbor as myself, to love the stranger and to protect the stranger. There's nothing in the red letters of Jesus that can justify what has taken place in this country and justified by Christians. The whole Beatitudes, we need to rip it out.
I appreciate your words. I appreciate your transparency and your honesty. What were you going to say, Doug?
Well, I think the other thing to remember in terms of the social context, this is, as a historian, in terms of the social context that we're living in, is we are moving towards a time, 2040, 2050.
That's right.
When white people will not be, we know this, will not be a majority any longer in our country.
Their fears.
And people know this. And I would agree with AG that there's this underlying angst among many, many white people that we're not going to be in charge anymore. And you know what? That's probably true. And people are some people are at least implicitly or maybe subconsciously trying to push that time back, trying to make sure that that's not going to happen too quickly. And I do think that a lot of the fear that AG is talking about is this, and why are white people fearful of this? Because I think they're fearful that the chickens are going to come home to roost.
Home to roost, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
That all these hundreds of years of us actually being in charge and kind of controlling things, people are going to say, this isn't going to happen anymore. And no wonder we're fearful. But what are the values, AG's, again, as a Christian, what are the values that we should be promoting? Should I let those fears be what controls me? Shouldn't I, one, trust in the Lord, and number two, believe that because all people are equal in God's sight, that actually it doesn't matter who is in charge, and that actually maybe I do want a diverse society because that reflects God's kingdom. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
No, that's really, really good, guys. I mean, I think you're hitting on some crucial themes and truths that there's a lot of people that feel many different ways that they might not be willing to say publicly, but they'll be willing to vote on privately or do. It's like whenever you get the chance, like when it's anonymous and when someone is able to really kind of just do something that not everyone's going to know, then their kind of real heart might come out, and again, it's a really complicated thing. It's a complicated time we're in. And that's why I'm thankful for this book and for this story and this example of someone who very much against the current of his time acted in a way in his behavior and the heroes of this book and their behavior to show care, show grace, and show love. What's your hope for the book? What do you want it to accomplish, and what are your prayers that it accomplishes?
Here's my hope, and I'm going to read it to you from James Bradley.
Thank you.
Again, remember, this is David Ingram's classmate at Oberlin and an African-American student. So this is James Bradley writing. He's probably about 20 years old when he's writing this as a student. And what does he say? This is my hope, too. This is Doug Strong's hope. And he says, may God strengthen you in this holy cause. And the holy cause is dismantling racism. Until the walls of prejudice are broken down, the chains burst in pieces, and people of every color meet at the feet of Jesus, speaking kind words and looking upon each other in love, willing to live together on earth as they hope to live in heaven. That's my hope, is that this book and conversations like this can spur people toward a more just, loving society where, as Bradley says, where we all sit together at the feet of Jesus.
It's so powerful. What about you, AG?
Well, I agree. Thank you, Doug, for bringing James into this, because I think as great as the Ingram find is, I could not have participated in this project unless the other two voices were involved. That is Nancy Prince and James Bradley. Because what we find in them is that they find their own sense of agency coming out of their Christian faith to be able to speak truth to power, but to do it in a way that calls for justice. Their voices are as critical to this story as is David Ingram. And I think that what I hope that comes out of this book is that we begin to see not just the ways in which white people can shift and change and think through and to work beyond their fears, but also to see the ways in which African Americans found the courage to be able to stand and to take hold of their own agency and to see themselves as true children of God that deserve to have the respect and the abilities to live in this country and in the world. Because it's not just a story of America. This is a story of America and Jamaica, and it's also a story of Benin, and from which many of those Africans who were captured on that ship came from. This is a global story. It has international implications about what does it mean to be a child of God in this world. And I hope that we capture some of that spirit in this book. And I think that's why we've got we have the study guide. We want it to be accessible to folk. Go to awakeningtojustice.com. It's all free. All you have to do is buy the book. Buy the book, but everything else is free, because this is not a money-making proposition for us. This is a work of faith and ministry for us.
Wow.
Because we see this as a crucial task of our generation, and particularly at this time that we're in right now. We wrote this during COVID and Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And when people were in the streets, even in the midst of COVID, protesting the brutalities that they saw in this country.
Yeah.
So timing is everything, right? So yes. We had not anticipated that Donald Trump would come back to power, and that the possibilities of the 2025 plan might actually be implemented. But this is for such a time as this.
That's so powerful.
That this
really
might be, we need to be studying this and challenging ourselves to think about where we are and how we need to brace ourselves, but also be courageous in our actions as we come into this next year, 2025, and what might be unleashed. I pray to God it's not.
Yeah, yeah.
But the high likelihood is that it will be. And it might be that this is the place where those people who are really called as Christians, as people of followers of Jesus, if they stand up to what might be coming, it will be a test of their faith. And just like Paul might be writing to the church from Rome to Philippi, we might be saying that we have to put all of our faith and trust in God. And so
well said.
I just think that this is a crucial time, and I think the book is just one tool along with the film and the study guides. And I pray that people, churches and youth groups and others at this critical moment, take this book and do some deep dive into reflection about what it means to be a Christian, to be not even a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus.
That's right. That's right.
In this time.
That's so good. AG and Doug, I appreciate you guys coming on the program so much. Doug, how can people get the book? How can they connect with you guys? Or I heard AG mention the website. If you could just say that again for everyone.
Awakening to Justice.
Yeah, one word, awakeningtojustice.com. And as AG mentioned, you can, there's not only can you purchase the book, there's also an audio book available.
That's right.
Which is on the link to that is on the website. As AG mentioned, if people are interested.
Kindle. It's on Kindle.
Kindle's there. If people are interested in doing a study group based on this story, in their churches, there is this free study guide that's on the website. All you have to do, you can download it or print it out, and that you can use. It's free access. And then there's also this film. It's a 35-minute film documentary based on the whole story, which you can watch as well. And there also on the website are some sermon ideas, more about each of all the individuals that are a part of our team, some photographs.
Yeah. The Requiem, the musical, one of our members is a composer. And when he saw and read the Ingram diary and saw that the diagram of the slave ship and the surroundings of what it looked like and Ingram's response to it, he said, I heard music. And so he writes a requiem.
Yeah, this is the diagram from the book of the slave ship. That's from Ingram's diary.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Put in his diary.
Yeah, and so he writes a requiem. It's only about 15, 20 minutes long to the middle passage that is performed, and you can actually, if you're moved by it, you can actually download the script or the score, and you can organize your own church choir, youth group, whatever, to sing it and to use it as a way of getting into an understanding the sentiments of the time frame of that this book is written about.
Well, that's so good. And guys, I appreciate it so much for you coming on the program. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And to our viewers and listeners, thanks for joining us for another episode of Faithful Politics. We'll put links in the show notes so you guys can get a hold of the book and go to the website. But you can also, of course, do that on your own. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless, guys. Take care. Hey there, Josh Burtram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.